The domestic violence situation was escalating fast in the mall parking lot. A man with a knife threatening his ex-girlfriend, screaming about custody and betrayal while shoppers fled in panic. Police were still 5 minutes away when security guard Linda Martinez walked calmly toward the scene, positioned herself at exactly the right distance, and said 3 words that made the man lower his weapon. "Tell me about Emma." She'd never met him before, but somehow she knew his daughter's name, his fear of losing her, and exactly how to reach the part of him that still wanted to be a good father. Welcome to Untold Valor Stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale of hidden expertise and the power of words to save lives, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who protect us through understanding rather than force. Westfield Shopping Center employed 12 security guards across 3 shifts, but everyone agreed that Linda Martinez was different. She worked the evening shift, PM to PM, when the mall was busiest and problems were most likely to occur. Teenage groups gathering after school, domestic disputes spilling over from parking lot arguments, shoplifting incidents that could escalate into confrontations, and the occasional mental health crisis that required more than standard security training. Linda had been working mall security for 9 years, and in that time, she'd never once had to call for backup to handle a situation she couldn't resolve. Through conversation, store managers requested her specifically when dealing with difficult customers. Other guards called her when situations were getting out of hand. The mall administration considered her their secret weapon for keeping incidents from becoming emergencies. What made Linda exceptional wasn't her physical presence. At 5'6" and 140 pounds, she was smaller than most of the male guards. It wasn't her equipment. She carried the same radio, flashlight, and basic gear as everyone else. It was her ability to make people want to cooperate instead of forcing them to comply. Linda could defuse angry customers who were screaming at store clerks, convince shoplifters to return merchandise without filing charges, and somehow talk troubled teenagers into calling their parents instead of running away from problems. Her incident reports read more like counseling session summaries than security documentation, filled with psychological insights that helped management understand not just what had happened, but why it had happened. The mall community had developed an almost religious faith in Linda's ability to solve problems that seemed unsolvable. When conflicts arose that other guards couldn't handle, the first response was always get Linda. When emergency situations developed, people looked for Linda before calling 911. When parents lost children in crowded stores, they asked for Linda, because she somehow always knew how to talk to scared kids in ways that made them feel safe. What the community didn't know was that Linda's expertise in crisis intervention had been developed during 14 years with the FBI's crisis negotiation team, where she'd talked down armed suspects, prevented suicides, and negotiated the release of hostages in some of the most dangerous situations federal law enforcement encountered. Linda had joined the FBI after completing degrees in psychology and criminal justice, initially planning to work in behavioral analysis. But her natural ability to connect with people under extreme stress had led to specialized training in crisis negotiation, advanced courses in psychological intervention, and eventually assignment to the FBI's elite crisis negotiation team that handled the most difficult cases. Her career had ended not because of failure, but because of success. That came with costs she'd never anticipated. After 14 years of talking people down from ledges, both literal and metaphorical, Linda had accumulated psychological burdens that made continuing in high-stress federal work unsustainable. She'd prevented dozens of suicides, negotiated the release of hundreds of hostages, and saved countless lives through words instead of weapons. But she'd also lost people. Negotiations that had failed despite her best efforts. Hostages who'd died because she couldn't find the right words fast enough. Suspects who'd chosen death over surrender despite hours of careful psychological intervention. The weight of those failures, combined with the constant pressure of life or death communication, had convinced Linda to leave federal service and find work that used her skills without carrying the same psychological costs. Mall security had seemed perfect for someone who understood human psychology but wanted to work in environments where the stakes were lower and the pressure was manageable. Linda could use her training to help people while avoiding the kind of high-intensity crisis work that had defined her FBI career. For 9 years, the arrangement had worked perfectly. Linda had found satisfaction in preventing minor problems from becoming major emergencies, helping people resolve conflicts that could have escalated into violence, and building genuine relationships with a community that valued her contributions to their safety and well-being. But maintaining perfect operational security for 9 years required constant vigilance about which aspects of her crisis intervention expertise she could display without raising questions about her background. Linda had to be effective enough to solve problems while being careful not to demonstrate capabilities that would make people wonder where mall security guards learned advanced psychological intervention techniques, until a domestic violence situation in the parking lot would force her to choose between maintaining her cover and saving lives. Tuesday evening, November 14th, started normally for Linda's shift. The after-school crowd was beginning to thin out, dinner rush at the food court was winding down, and the mall was settling into the quieter evening hours when families with small children headed home, and older teenagers began arriving for social activities that parents didn't always approve of. At 7:23 p.m., Linda received a radio call from the parking lot security cameras. "Linda, we've got a situation developing in Lot C, near the Macy's entrance. Looks like a domestic dispute, getting heated." Linda acknowledged the call and began walking toward the incident, automatically shifting into the assessment mode that had been drilled into her during years of federal training. Domestic violence calls were among the most dangerous situations that law enforcement encountered, unpredictable, emotionally charged, and likely to escalate quickly if handled incorrectly. As Linda exited the mall into the parking lot, she could hear shouting before she could see the source. A man's voice, angry and desperate, making threats that carried the particular edge that experienced negotiators recognized as genuine rather than performative. A woman's voice, frightened but trying to remain calm, using the kind of measured responses that suggested she'd dealt with this situation before. Linda positioned herself behind a parked car approximately 50 feet from the incident, close enough to observe and assess, but far enough to avoid escalating the situation through her presence. What she saw was a textbook domestic violence confrontation that was rapidly approaching the point where someone was going to get seriously hurt. A man in his early 30s, approximately 6'2" and 200 pounds, was standing between a woman and her car, holding a 4-inch kitchen knife in his right hand. He was blocking her access to the vehicle while shouting about custody arrangements, financial support, and accusations of infidelity that suggested a recent divorce or separation. The woman, mid-20s, was positioned against the car door, trying to maintain distance while keeping her hands visible and her voice calm. She was responding to his accusations with the kind of careful language that domestic violence survivors learn to use, acknowledging his feelings without agreeing with his demands, avoiding direct contradiction that might trigger more violence. Linda conducted the systematic threat assessment that FBI training had made automatic. The suspect was armed but not holding the weapon in an immediately threatening position. He was agitated but still engaging in conversation rather than making direct threats of violence. The victim was scared but not panicked, suggesting she retained some influence over the situation. Most importantly, Linda could hear specific details in the man's shouting that provided psychological leverage points for intervention. He was talking about his daughter Emma, his fear of losing custody, his belief that the victim was preventing him from being a good father. These weren't the words of someone planning murder, they were the words of someone whose desperation had overwhelmed his judgment. Linda activated her radio to request police response, then made a decision that would reveal more about her background than 9 years of careful operational security. She was going to intervene using FBI crisis negotiation protocols that could save both the victim's life and prevent the suspect from making choices that would destroy his own future. Linda stepped out from behind the parked car and began walking slowly toward the incident, moving at the precise pace that negotiation training had taught her, fast enough to demonstrate confidence, slow enough to avoid triggering defensive responses. "Excuse me," Linda called out when she was approximately 25 feet away, using the calm but authoritative voice that she'd developed during hundreds of crisis interventions. "My name is Linda. I work security here, and I'm wondering if there's something I can help you both work out." The man turned toward Linda with the startled aggression of someone whose adrenaline was already elevated. "Stay back. This doesn't concern you." Linda stopped moving but didn't retreat, positioning herself in the specific geometric relationship to both the suspect and victim that maximized her influence while minimizing threat escalation. "You're right. This is between you and Linda." Paused, waiting for the woman to provide her name. "Jessica," the woman said quietly. "Between you and Jessica," Linda continued. "But I'm here because I can see this is about something really important to you, and I'm wondering if talking through it might help you get what you really need." The man's grip on the knife tightened, but Linda noticed that his attention was shifting from Jessica to her, which was exactly what successful intervention required, redirecting the suspect's focus away from the victim and toward the negotiator. "You don't know anything about what I need," he shouted. Linda nodded, acknowledging his statement without arguing with it. "You're absolutely right. I don't know your situation, but I can hear that this is about your daughter, and I can see that you're scared of losing something that matters more to you than anything else in the world." The man's expression shifted slightly, confusion mixing with anger as he processed Linda's response. Most people who confronted him either tried to calm him down or told him he was wrong. Linda had done neither. She'd acknowledged his fear and validated his emotional state without endorsing his actions. "Tell me about Emma," Linda said, using the name she'd heard him mention during his argument with Jessica. The words hit him like a physical blow. He'd never told Linda his daughter's name, and the fact that she'd somehow known it suggested that she'd been listening, understanding, and caring about what he was saying in ways that no one else had. For the first time since Linda had arrived, the man lowered the knife slightly and really looked at her. "How do you know about Emma?" the man asked, his voice carrying confusion rather than anger. "For the first time since Linda had arrived. Because you've been talking about her," Linda replied, maintaining the calm tone that kept the conversation moving forward rather than escalating backward. "And because I can see that losing time with her is what's really scaring you right now." Linda was using a technique called emotional labeling, identifying and verbalizing the emotions that were driving the suspect's behavior. It was designed to make him feel understood rather than judged, which was essential for building the rapport that would allow her to influence his decision-making. "Nobody understands," he said, the knife now pointing toward the ground rather than at Jessica. "Everyone thinks I'm just some angry ex-husband, but I'm trying to be a good father." "What's making it hard to be the father you want to be?" Linda asked, using an open-ended question that encouraged him to explain his perspective rather than defend his actions. For the next 10 minutes, Linda conducted what any FBI crisis negotiator would recognize as a textbook intervention. She used active listening to understand his emotional state, reflected his feelings back to him in ways that made him feel heard, and gradually shifted the conversation from his immediate crisis to his long-term goals as a father. The man's name was David Rodriguez. He was 32 years old, recently divorced, and struggling with a custody arrangement that gave him limited time with his 5-year-old daughter Emma. He'd lost his job 3 months earlier, was behind on child support payments, and believed that Jessica was using his financial difficulties to restrict his access to Emma. "I just want to see my daughter," David said, his voice breaking. "I know I messed up the marriage, but Emma shouldn't have to pay for that." Linda recognized the psychological shift that indicated successful crisis intervention. David was no longer focused on his anger toward Jessica. He was thinking about his relationship with Emma and his desire to be a positive influence in her life. "David, what do you think Emma would want you to do right now?" Linda asked, using the technique of redirecting his decision-making through the perspective of someone he cared about more than himself. David looked at the knife in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. "She'd want me to be the dad who fixes problems, not the one who creates them." "What would fixing this problem look like?" Linda asked. David slowly bent down and placed the knife on the ground, then stepped back from both the weapon and Jessica. "I don't know. I just don't want to lose her." Linda approached David carefully, maintaining the non-threatening posture that kept him calm while positioning herself between him and the knife. "David, what if I told you that there are legal ways to address custody concerns that don't put your relationship with Emma at risk?" "Like what?" Linda began explaining the resources available for fathers dealing with custody issues: family court mediation services, legal aid organizations, counseling programs that help divorced parents develop healthy co-parenting relationships. As she talked, she was also conducting the post-crisis assessment that determined how to conclude the intervention safely. Police sirens were audible in the distance, which meant the situation would soon transition from crisis negotiation to law enforcement custody. Linda needed to ensure that David's surrender was voluntary and that he understood what would happen next. David, the police are going to be here in a few minutes, Linda said. What they see when they arrive is going to affect how this situation gets resolved. If they see someone who's made a mistake but is cooperating, that's very different from someone who's still making threats. David nodded, understanding the implications. What should I do? Linda walked David through the process of voluntary surrender, hands visible, compliant with police instructions, accepting responsibility for his actions while emphasizing his commitment to being a better father. When police arrived 3 minutes later, they found David sitting on the ground with his hands behind his head, the knife placed 10 feet away, and Jessica safely separated from the situation. Detective Maria Santos, who had been the responding officer, approached Linda as EMTs checked Jessica for injuries and David was being processed for arrest. I've been doing domestic violence calls for 12 years, Detective Santos told Linda. I've never seen a civilian handle a situation like that. Where did you learn crisis intervention techniques? Linda had been expecting this question for 9 years, but she still wasn't prepared for the decision she had to make about how much to reveal about her background. I had some training before I went into security work, Linda said carefully. What kind of training teaches someone to talk down an armed suspect using FBI negotiation protocols? Linda realized that Detective Santos had recognized her techniques as more than civilian crisis intervention training, the kind that requires security clearances I can't really discuss in detail. Detective Santos understood that she was being given a carefully constructed answer that revealed some truth while protecting classified information. How long were you federal? 14 years. Crisis negotiation specialist. And now you work mall security? Linda's answer revealed the complexity of transitioning from federal crisis work to civilian life. Turns out the skills transfer really well to preventing problems before they become emergencies. Detective Santos spent the next week following up on the David Rodriguez case, and with each interview and report she filed, her appreciation for Linda's crisis intervention expertise grew. David had been charged with assault and making threats, but the psychological evaluation ordered by the court had revealed someone who was struggling with depression and desperation rather than someone with violent criminal intent. More importantly, David had voluntarily entered counseling and anger management programs, had connected with legal aid services for his custody issues, and had begun the process of addressing the underlying problems that had led to his crisis. His cooperation and attitude had impressed court officials enough that his case was being handled through mental health court rather than standard criminal prosecution. Detective Santos recognized that the outcome had been largely determined by the quality of the crisis intervention that Linda had provided. David's voluntary surrender, his willingness to accept help, and his focus on being a better father had all been direct results of the psychological techniques that Linda had used during their conversation. But what impressed Detective Santos most wasn't just the successful outcome, it was the professional skill that Linda had demonstrated throughout the intervention. Santos began researching FBI crisis negotiation training to understand what kind of background could produce Linda's level of expertise. What she discovered was both impressive and concerning. FBI crisis negotiation team members were among the most highly trained psychological intervention specialists in law enforcement. They received extensive education in behavioral psychology, crisis intervention theory, and advanced communication techniques. They were deployed to the most dangerous situations that federal law enforcement encountered, and their success rates in preventing violence and saving lives were remarkable. The training was designed for situations where negotiators dealt with armed suspects, hostage situations, and crisis interventions where failure meant people died. It was sophisticated, effective, and definitely not the kind of background that most mall security guards possessed. A week after the David Rodriguez incident, Detective Santos returned to Westfield Shopping Center to continue a conversation that had been interrupted by the investigation. I've been thinking about our conversation, Santos told Linda during a quiet moment in the security office. Your background, the techniques you used with David, that's not standard civilian training. No, it's not. How extensive is your experience with crisis negotiation? Linda's answer was careful but honest. Extensive enough that I have to be very careful about how I use it in civilian situations. Have you been using those techniques on other people here at the mall? Every day, but for their benefit, not against them, Santos realized that Linda was describing a fundamental ethical choice about how to use potentially powerful psychological techniques. "Can you give me an example?" Linda told Santos about a teenager she'd encountered the previous month who'd been exhibiting behavioral indicators that suggested suicidal ideation. Using crisis assessment techniques, Linda had identified the warning signs, built rapport with the teenager, and guided her toward calling a crisis hotline that had likely saved her life. "The parents never knew their daughter was in crisis," Linda explained. "The school counselors hadn't recognized the signs, but the techniques I learned with the FBI allowed me to identify the problem and intervene before it became a tragedy." Santos began to understand that Linda had found a way to use federal crisis negotiation training for community protection rather than federal law enforcement. How often do you encounter situations that require that level of intervention? More often than you might think. Domestic violence, mental health crises, family conflicts, substance abuse problems. People come to malls when they're struggling, and sometimes a security guard is the first person in a position to notice they need help. Santos made a decision that would change both their careers. "Would you be interested in working with the police department? Not as an officer, but as a consultant on cases that require crisis intervention expertise?" Linda had been avoiding this question since the David Rodriguez incident. "What kind of cases?" "Crisis negotiation support, suicide prevention, domestic violence intervention. Situations where your background might help us save lives instead of just solving crimes." 6 months after Detective Santos first witnessed Linda's crisis negotiation expertise, their collaboration had evolved into one of the most effective crisis prevention partnerships the Hartford Police Department had ever developed. Linda continued working mall security, but she also provided consultation on police cases that required specialized crisis intervention, suicide prevention, or domestic violence response. Her contributions had helped resolve situations that might otherwise have ended in violence and had prevented crises that could have escalated into tragedies. The partnership operated under strict guidelines that protected both Linda's civilian identity and the ethical use of her psychological training. Linda never participated in interrogations or enforcement actions, focused exclusively on crisis prevention and intervention, and used her skills only for public safety applications. The results had been remarkable. Linda had helped prevent 12 suicide attempts, assisted with domestic violence interventions that had protected families from escalation, and provided crisis counseling that had helped people find resources they needed to address underlying problems before they became emergencies. But the most important outcome of the partnership was the training program they developed for other law enforcement officers. Linda began teaching crisis intervention techniques to police officers, security personnel, and emergency responders who needed to understand how psychological stress affected behavior and how to de-escalate situations through communication rather than force. "The techniques we use aren't manipulation," Linda explained to a class of police officers during one of her training sessions. "They're communication tools that help people feel understood so they can make better decisions about their own behavior." The training program had attracted attention from federal agencies that were interested in Linda's unique combination of FBI crisis negotiation experience and civilian crisis intervention applications. 6 months after beginning her collaboration with Detective Santos, Linda received a call from FBI Supervisory Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who was recruiting consultants for the Bureau's community policing initiatives. "Your reputation for crisis intervention and suicide prevention has reached federal attention," Agent Walsh told Linda during their initial meeting. "We're developing a program that uses crisis negotiation techniques for community policing and violence prevention." Linda was interested but cautious about expanding her involvement with law enforcement agencies. "What kind of program?" "Training law enforcement officers to prevent crises before they become emergencies, community engagement strategies that build trust through understanding rather than authority, and crisis intervention techniques that resolve conflicts without violence." Agent Walsh explained that the FBI had recognized the need for more sophisticated psychological approaches to community policing, especially in situations involving mental health crises, domestic violence, and prevention of mass violence events. "Your background gives you credibility with both law enforcement and civilian populations," Agent Walsh continued. "Your techniques have proven effective for crisis resolution without compromising civil liberties or community trust." Linda made a decision that surprised her. For 9 years, she'd avoided any involvement that might expose her FBI background, but the opportunity to use her training for community protection on a larger scale was exactly the kind of meaningful work she'd been hoping to find. I'm interested, but I have conditions. What kind of conditions? Complete transparency about how the techniques are used. No applications that manipulate people for law enforcement advantage. Focus exclusively on crisis prevention and public safety. Agent Walsh agreed to Linda's conditions, and within 3 months, she was traveling across the country training law enforcement officers in crisis intervention techniques for community protection. 2 years after Detective Santos first witnessed Linda's crisis negotiation expertise, the principles they developed together had been implemented by law enforcement agencies across the United States. Linda continued working part-time mall security not because she needed the job, but because it provided ongoing opportunities to practice community-focused applications of her crisis intervention training. But her primary work had evolved into something larger, teaching other people how to use understanding of human psychology for crisis prevention rather than law enforcement. The training programs Linda developed were being used by police departments, crisis intervention teams, school counselors, and security professionals who needed to understand how psychological stress affected behavior and how to help people make better decisions through communication rather than coercion. The techniques we learned with the FBI were designed for crisis resolution and violence prevention, Linda told a conference of police chiefs during one of her presentations. But the same understanding of human psychology can be used to prevent crises from developing, help people solve problems before they become desperate, and build community trust through understanding rather than authority. Linda had discovered that the most effective way to use crisis negotiation training in civilian life was to focus on empowering people rather than controlling them. Instead of extracting compliance for law enforcement purposes, she used communication techniques to help people express their needs and find resources. Instead of manipulating behavior for tactical advantage, she helped people understand their own motivations and make informed decisions. The partnership with Detective Santos continued to be productive, but it had also inspired similar collaborations between retired federal agents with specialized training and civilian law enforcement agencies that needed their expertise. Some days I prevent crises by helping people solve problems before they become desperate, Linda told Santos during one of their regular coordination meetings. Some days I help police officers understand why people behave the way they do under stress. Every day, I use training that was designed for federal law enforcement to help communities stay peaceful. Detective Santos had learned to appreciate both Linda's expertise and her ethical approach to using potentially powerful psychological techniques. Do you ever miss the federal applications of your training? Linda looked around the mall where families were shopping peacefully, teenagers were socializing safely, and elderly people were walking for exercise in climate-controlled comfort. I thought leaving the FBI meant giving up the opportunity to save lives through crisis intervention. Instead, I discovered that preventing community crises is the most direct way to protect the people I cared about serving. The Westfield shopping center remained exactly what it appeared to be, a retail complex where people came to shop, eat, and socialize. But it was also something more, a place where someone with advanced understanding of human psychology used her training to protect people who never knew they needed protection. Linda had found peace not by abandoning her FBI training, but by transforming it into something that served the communities she'd learned to call home. Her story proved that the most effective crisis negotiators could become the most effective community protectors, using knowledge of human nature to help people rather than control them. And in conference rooms across America, law enforcement officers were learning that sometimes the best way to prevent violence was to understand why people became violent in the first place, and to help them find better solutions before desperation drove them toward choices that would hurt themselves and others.